Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. Hey, welcome back to the Debrief podcast. It has been a while, but we're back. That's Jackie Augustine. I'm Josh Durso, and we have a packed hour coming up. Jackie, it has been, I just looked at the calendar, 3 months.
Really?
It's been a quarter.
Oh, well,
It has been a quarter.
I'm sorry.
But we're here. Good thing for everybody else. Absolutely nothing's happened in the last 3 months.
Sure, yeah.
No news, especially not this past weekend. There was no news at all. It's funny, like, we usually get probably like 24 to 30 messages, emails to debrief at fingerlakes1.com with questions and stuff for us to talk about a month. And in the last, for now 16 hours while we're recording, we've gotten 42, because President Joe Biden said he is dropping out of the race. And while there were a lot of national politic questions that I don't really want to get into today, there was one that I thought was interesting because of the congressional races and some of the other contests that we have coming up in November. What will be the impact, or what is the impact of Joe Biden dropping out of the race now on those contests? There's been a lot of debate about it. Do you feel any particular way strongly one way or another? Do you think most people's minds in those races have been made up? Because I kind of feel like that's where I'm at on it.
Maybe. I mean, I can never really tell how engaged people are with the congressional races, especially this far out. We came through a primary where I think there was a lot of fair criticism. I'm thinking about in the Tenney race, there was a lot of fair criticism of some of her policy positions. However, the alternatives presented in that primary were not necessarily what I thought were the right responses to the counter proposals to the criticisms. I think overall this move might help turn out more Democratic and independent voters at the top of the ticket, which obviously has, just statistically speaking, some down ballot impact. But I don't know if it's going to change the conversation locally. I wish it would. I wish people locally would engage in a more nuanced discussion of issues like immigration, given how critical to our economic development agriculture is. But still, we've got very partisan people who don't want to actually get into the weeds of this issue and won't ever compromise. They don't like the idea of compromise, and that's hurting us. But maybe there can be more sensible dialogue on that issue. But I'm eternally optimistic. I don't know if that'll actually happen.
Yeah, so for me, I don't think it has that big of an impact because having covered congressional races, Senate races, even state Senate, state assembly races for 10, 11 years now, they're always this weird mixed bag of national and local issues. And I think it's so hard. I think it gets really hard for the voter to get an interest in the race, in those races, because they go back and forth so often. So I've been to congressional town halls where, a candidate will be talking about foreign policy and these really heavy global topics one minute, and then they're talking about a farm down the street the next minute. And I just think that that's very hard. When you're talking about local politics, it's very linear. You're talking about a set of issues that very much go together or feel like they go together. When you're talking about presidential politics, you're talking about big, broad topics that are very linear. It feels very like it fits in a lane and a pattern. And congressional races and Senate races sometimes go both ways, and it gets really hard. So I say all that to say, like, I think most people's minds are made up. Even with everything that's happened in the presidential race over the last month, there hasn't been a ton of sway since the debate in terms of polling numbers. So if you believe the polls, they're moving a little bit, but they're not moving drastically. So will people's minds have been changed drastically, or to a point where they will suddenly become more engaged with these down ballot races because a new individual is at the top of the ticket? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
It's-
it is discouraging to see how locked into a talking points
Okay.
kind of politics that we are right now. People don't want to talk about the details. They don't want to think about the political implications of policies. They just think something sounds good and it's rah rah on one side and no way on the other. And I think people need to really understand your local candidates matter, and we'll probably talk about even more local impact and why people should be paying attention. But I hope there's some more engagement now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of time between now and November, so we'll see how that goes. And I'm sure we'll be talking about these things more as the months go on, as we get closer to November. But let's talk about housing. Ontario County taking what I have called the most aggressive step to having a real conversation about the housing crisis out of any county in the entire state. I've done a lot of digging. Obviously, I did an interview this past month with 3 individuals from the ad hoc committee that is essentially taking this to all the towns and villages and cities in Ontario County. The 167-page report is incredibly thorough. It shows all of the pros, the cons, the everything in between. But I was curious. I've been so deep in this thing for so long now that I'm curious what other people are thinking. When you see, obviously, you've seen the report, you saw the interview, you said, when you see what Ontario County is trying to do, what stands out to you?
Well, I think this might be a time when you're the more optimistic of the two of us, because while I am glad that Ontario County did this report and is now going out into communities and doing kind of a show and tell with the findings, they were before Geneva City Council last month. I think they stand out for having done a report, but that's because they've had to react to the fact that they're one of the only counties that doesn't have a housing department that hasn't already been working on these issues all along the way. So I think by contrast, it looks like Ontario County is kind of out in front, but really they're playing catch up. And my concern, and I'm not just talking about downstate counties. Again, and I've tried to put this forward in some of the columns. We are seeing counties and more rural counties west of us who are taking much more aggressive stance towards vacation rentals and understanding what that's doing to the housing stock, who are taking seriously the new legislation that allows rent control in the face of a housing crisis, a housing shortage in rental properties. Those are things Ontario County is still lagging behind. We don't have meaningful short-term rental legislation at the county level. We don't have protections for tenants on the county level in the way some other counties have. We don't have an adopted affordable housing policy. We don't even have a county-run Section 8 program. We do, but it's offloaded to the Geneva Housing Authority. That came up in the recent city council meeting, and it's clear city council doesn't understand it. They're not fully engaged with it. The Ontario County supervisors kind of think it's being taken care of by Geneva, and there is a disconnect. So I'm glad they're doing what they're doing now, but this report says the stuff that people on the ground, living it, working on it, in the space, asking about this, checking in on housing, looking at what other communities have been doing all along, have been trying to say and haven't been heard yet. So I'm glad to see it's like institutionalized now that yes, this is true. These are the conditions. Here's what should be done. Here are best practices from other places. Now I'm ready for them to do those things.
Okay, so my question and I'm genuinely curious because while I understand that on paper a lot of other counties may have programs outside or more established county departments,
Yes.
outside of Monroe, I'm not sure any of them in the Finger Lakes are robust. Like
But
Wayne County has, and no shade to Wayne County, but Wayne County has a housing department, sort of. But the housing crisis is just as serious in Wayne County as it is in every other county around, right? Like it's not like these communities that on paper seem to have been doing something longer are necessarily in a better place.
That's a fair point. I think what I'm saying is that without the structure to take the issue of housing seriously until this point,
Yeah.
the county has not been as quick to act. We've had this report out for a while, and no measures have been taken other than forming a committee to continue talking about the measures. And other counties have been able to respond more quickly. And that's, again, short-term rental ordinances, rent stabilization boards, different housing interventions, right? Tompkins County has a very robust, are they part of our Finger Lakes Economic Development?
I think they're part of the Southern Tier.
Okay,
I
okay.
believe.
But there are other Southern Tier counties, around the Binghamton area. There are a lot of people have been talking about this in the local government space, both at the State Association of Counties, but also NICOM, the New York State Conference of Mayors. There have been case studies and test cases. I'm not saying any other county has solved the problem yet, but they have the infrastructure that they're already passing things. They're already working on things that we're still, best case scenario, a year out from, I think. So I feel like we've had we keep talking about there's a housing crisis. I've never seen I won't say I've never seen. I'm disappointed to see such a slow response to a crisis situation. To me, crisis response means action. And it's not like, I'm not saying rush, be hasty, do bad things, do short-term things. We're seeing, in Geneva, they've passed a short-term housing, but it's been so watered down. Better than nothing, but still not solving the problem because they weren't equipped yet to have the discussion. They need to do the homework to figure out what would really work and to take it seriously instead of just a soundbite. We don't want to be told by the state, so we're going to do it this way. I mean, people need to take the issue seriously. So let me, in fairness to the county, back up and say, forming the committee, going around and doing the show and tell with the study is a good thing. I'm glad they're doing it. I want them to continue this work. But I do want to consistently continue to send the message that this is not new information. These are not new strategies, and it really shouldn't take this long for us to understand that residents need help.
Agreed. And I would even up the ante there. I think the part where I understand why there is a lot of frustration is the policy side of it. But it's interesting to me observing from the outside is that, while this committee now is tasked with going around communities in Ontario County, essentially pitching housing solutions to different communities, it's on those communities and the elected folks inside those communities to get behind them and ultimately decide they're going to go forward, unless the county wants to take on policy.
Right.
I would say one thing that this all is a positive for is that it documents the numbers. Mm-hmm. Can't debate it anymore, right? Like you can't debate the rental numbers, the rental unit numbers. You can't debate what's happened, the trend line with rent rates. You can't debate how much housing costs now compared to before.
Yeah, and for that, I'm very grateful because it's an ability for a lot of people who've been working in this space. not that anyone wants to say, I told you so, but to be able to be taken seriously now in a way that before people were like, oh, I don't see it. I don't think there's a problem. Now it's on paper. Now it's been said by somebody else that maybe they will trust. And now that paves the way for some action.
Yeah, and I think it's probably going to take time. My point of view is that it will take time for the policy to, the policy is a response to the change in view that the general public has. And I think to this point, and it came up during my interview with the committee, is that, you know, for the people who, for a lion's share of the folks who make up any community in Ontario County, they've owned their home for a long time. And it isn't an issue for them. That the housing crisis that exists doesn't exist the way it does for perhaps their children or their grandchildren who are trying to move back to Ontario County or trying to find a place to live in Ontario County. And all of a sudden, rent is $2,000, or, you know, buying a home that was $125,000 6 years ago is all of a sudden $350,000 now. There's just random numbers I'm throwing out, but that's the, you have to, I think, package it up and explain to folks who have been insulated from the problems, from the crisis, that it is a real crisis. And the report at least starts it. And I understand there's a level of like dissonance there, that
Right.
like where people have been allowed to essentially just bury their heads in the sand for the last however many years. But it goes, I think that's at least part of the explanation as to why policy will take time.
I agree with that. And I have, you know, just one more thing I think to say on it, which is that hopefully this is a wake-up call to the elected representatives, the boards of supervisors, that housing is an economic development issue. It's the economic development issue. And they've never seen it that way before. And part of it is because we are living in a complaints-based governance structure, right? The board of supervisors, if they don't hear anybody complaining, there must not be a problem. They don't understand how school enrollment, workforce recruitment, workforce development, all of these things are tied to housing access. And it is a failure of the existing government structure that supervisors didn't know that, didn't get that message, and couldn't communicate it. I mean, again, an elected official's job is not just to receive information from their constituents and take that up to a board. They're supposed to know what's going on, to see threats and challenges coming, to see opportunities, and help transmit that information back to residents. So the fact that the committee went to Bloomfield and got pushback tells me that there hadn't been any governing infrastructure there to explain to people in Bloomfield why the economic development issues they're interested in and the school issues that they're interested in are fundamentally housing issues.
Yeah, and one other note here that really stood out to me after I had some time to digest everything, two actually. The first is the reality that, at least according to folks in the industry, building new housing that costs between $150,000 or $250,000 for the end user, the person who's going to purchase it, apparently not economically viable at this point, the way the market exists right now, whether that's because of cost of property or cost of goods to build, whatever the case may be. But there's between 1,200 and 1,500 abandoned housing units in Ontario County, and simply bringing them online over, say, 5 or 8 years would profoundly impact in a positive way,
Absolutely.
the housing market. And I just think about this in terms, and zooming out, like even way beyond Ontario County, that's Ontario County. But imagine if you did that in every community, in every county. It could greatly impact the problem that we're seeing, and somewhat equalize the market and how out of sync that it's been with supply and demand. So, that to me, you drive around Ontario County, and they said it, like you don't think like, oh, there's 1,200 plus empty, vacant, abandoned units in this county. But There are, and that's a big number. Obviously, it would take time to, you know, make amends on all those, but it's something to aim for, and I think it's something that's like short term, more feasible to aim for, in lieu of some of those policies that would also help too. Staying with Ontario County, let's talk about the landfill. I think for the average person, they're sitting there listening. What do you mean the Ontario County landfill? It's closing in a few years. What do you mean? Jackie, talk to us about what's happened or not happened or where we stand right now with that.
Well, I mean, I was under the impression it was closing as well. I know Town of Seneca has come out and said that they do, when the permit expires, that they do want it to close. However, in anticipating that, the county hired a consulting firm to tell them, all right, let's try planning foreclosure. What does it look like? Yeah. They just rolled that out. It was a somewhat public meeting. I don't actually remember receiving any kind of like invitation or notice about it, but I do know some members of the public attended. I did not directly. However, thankfully, there's a really robust group of people who are now understanding that. I mean, there have always been people who understood they needed to pay attention to this issue, but I think that people understand now that absent the county supervisors on the west side of the county, right? The people who are upwind of the landfill, who don't drive by it very often, who enjoy the revenue in terms of kind of lower county taxes, but don't really deal with the truck traffic, the noise, pollution, litter, et cetera, not to mention the smell. They don't think about it very much. I think people are understanding now that attitude, out of sight, out of mind, has really put us in a predicament. And people are paying closer attention on the east side, led by county supervisors who really are taking it seriously. So that's been a positive change for Geneva to actually have a crew that's advocating to get good information about the landfill and to not take keeping it open as like a foregone conclusion. So they did the consultants did kind of a show and tell of their initial findings. In reviewing, again, the information coming to me secondhand from members of the public, it was a little wanting. There were some clear blind spots in the consultants, some statements they made about kind of lack of infrastructure for alternative disposal methods, which kind of ignores some of the stuff the city and the town of the city and the town of Geneva have been doing, and also some within the city of Canandaigua, though they're having a hard time kind of getting supervisor buy-in on that. I think that the consultants kind of took a snapshot of what they were provided by the county, I presume by the county Office of Sustainability, which again seems to not have a full handle on what's going on in all parts of the county, and produced a report that made it look like keeping the landfill open is financially the best option for the county. I think more questions could be asked about not only the method of the study, but the conclusions, because again, there are some pretty big blind spots in it.
I guess the question a lot of people would have is, what kind of impact would that have on the minds of the supervisors being changed? Because it seems like the political consensus, at least from my vantage point, is that the landfill will be closing in 2028. Is that not a foregone conclusion? Is there a legitimate chance that it not close?
Yeah, no, I would love to just keep saying that in case that makes it true. But no, I do think on the western side of Ontario County, supervisors are kind of coalescing around this idea of how could they keep it running? How could they expand? There's both a consideration of a vertical and a horizontal expansion of the site, which obviously Casella is on board with. But then there's also discussions of how to use the site in ways that keep Casella in business and able to import trash. I mean, some of the stuff from the presentation made clear the landfill could serve the county's purposes for decades. if we now some county supervisors will say, well, we tried running it before and that was a disaster. I mean, right, that they want to act like nothing ever changes over time. If you did something once, then A, you have to do it exactly the same way forever. B, there've been no technological or staffing changes that might lead to a different solution. Or C, that there's no other public-private model that would be considered other than mega landfill that imports trash from across the Northeast, or small group of county workers running it all by themselves 24 hours a day. Like, again, lack of creativity, lack of imagination, and just lack of awareness of other options. And that's what concerns me. It doesn't seem like county supervisors, again, on the western side of the county, I want to give credit to the Geneva area and town of Seneca supervisors who are taking this seriously and doing a lot of homework on it. It's really hard to get some of the other group to think about it when it seems so easy to just go with what they see as a cash cow. And, I think in the long term, we will regret it, but I think they're banking on in the long term they won't be in office, so it won't matter what people think. And that is a bad disposition to take on an issue so seriously.
To our knowledge, are there any other consultant meetings on the books or that have been discussed?
I don't know, and unfortunately, I feel like the fact that I'm talking about it now is going to make them close ranks even more. So I apologize.
I just looked on the county's website, and there's nothing on the calendar, so I didn't see anything. I just wasn't sure if you were aware of anything.
I mean, I don't know if the consultant report was one and done. I'd hope there'd be follow-up, but again, trying to navigate county government in Ontario County with their group of committees that are meeting, and then their very quick sessions when they meet as a full group, it is kind of difficult as an outsider to try to figure it out. But on an issue of this magnitude, maybe they will take this housing study show and tell method seriously and start doing that to engage the public on other big, critical economic development issues. Because again, people want to point to the money that comes in from the landfill, but people need to be thinking long term about the economic development implications of keeping an ever higher, ever wider mound of trash in people's backyard.
Fair, definitely. So let's talk about another city issue that cropped up at the last meeting in July. Ordinarily, I have done my interview with Mayor Steve Valentino by now, but unfortunately, I've had some things come up this month, plus the holiday, so I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet. So I'm going to try to stay as down the middle as I can about this, but essentially, City Council voted, I believe, 5-3 to kill basically a communications position, a community engagement position at the last meeting. I saw so many posts on Facebook about this in the 48 hours after the meeting. I thought it was going to be the top thing that was reported on afterwards. It wasn't, but it seems, well, let's get your take first. Where do you stand on this? Because this was a budgeted position, correct? Right. So it was a budgeted position for this year. It just wasn't filled. They posted the job. The job started to get applications, as I understand. I don't know how many. But then
it said over a dozen.
Yeah. So okay, it was going to pay, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000 or $70,000 a year.
But this was
minus
the 6 months
minus benefits.
Right.
That was just an annualized.
Right. Yep.
So it wasn't like an extraordinary salary. I mean, that's pretty standard for around here. And then just no, it's gone, wiped out. 5-3 was the vote. So what do we make of that? What's the response been from your side? What have you seen or heard?
Well, in full disclosure, I did go and speak against them cutting the position, and I have a column coming out tomorrow about my thoughts on it. But I will just say I wasn't surprised that the counselor who introduced it, because in general, I can't figure out I wasn't surprised that that counselor tried to do that. I think it reflects a lack of knowledge about government operations. I'll just say that. What I was surprised by, and I would love if you bring it up when you meet with the mayor, was his statement that not only was he glad to be voting, again. Well, I think he said he wasn't glad to vote against it because he just wished it hadn't been in the budget in the first place because he's opposed to the position. I didn't understand that because the mayor served on council when we've had this position and has seen firsthand the work it did. Several people have served in this position over time, starting when Matt Horn was city manager, but continuing most recently, Jessica Avila held this position, and it was really critical in getting information to residents, particularly, residents who don't necessarily speak English as a first language, but also just renters, members of the public who are, too busy to come to City Hall, and their last meeting was at 4 p.m, to come to a meeting and hear what's going on. But I guess what kind of boggled the mind is that a lot of their complaints during their strategic planning process, which they continued to talk about this month, and then immediately after the vote, when they were complaining that they couldn't figure out where the fire hydrant flushing schedule was, they kept emphasizing how important it was to have good communication with residents. And yet they cut this position, which again, as you mentioned, had already been budgeted for. And I just don't understand how they can expect city staff to do their job well when they're stripped of the resources they need that had already been budgeted. And mid-year, there's going to be a course correction that adds to everybody's work plan when they continue to demand ever-increasing output from an ever-decreasing size of staff. It just seems, it just didn't make any sense.
Yeah, so I guess, and I have a communications-related topic that we're going to talk about in another community here coming up down the line. If it's a simple budget issue, meaning city council feels that it would be a better spend of the resources to do something else with the money or to just spend less, then okay, fine. But it seems, judging from the quotes that were in the Finger Lakes Times and just some of the things that I saw on social media, that there's also this assumption that communications, having a governing body or a municipality having a communications person is a bad thing, like you're worse for it, or that communicating with people through the means that people actually use, which isn't, unfortunately, the newspaper, which often is not news organizations, which often is social media, just isn't necessary, it doesn't matter. That is, to me, the challenge. And I believe the city manager made it clear that social media postings, for example, would be less frequent because she's backfilled and they don't have the staff they don't have the time to do it.
Yeah, I mean,
you get what you get in that situation. Would be my response to eliminating the position. Then you're just not going to see as much. And if I understand the perspective from some of the city councilors, I think, was that this person was going to do the job of engaging with the public for them, or going to try to do that on their behalf. But I didn't really read the position like that. I did see the job listing. I read it before it was taken off the internet. That to me is a sign, I guess, that there was a misunderstanding, or maybe not a complete understanding, heading into this year of what the duties of the job would actually be, despite there being a job listing.
Yes, and
a
after
job
the vote,
description,
the vote, some of them said, "Oh, I hadn't heard it described like that." Well, it's posted on the city's website. So again, I mean, we got a miscommunication amongst the elected officials, yet they're expecting that residents should navigate something they themselves are having trouble figuring out. And it was so ironic. I mean, I apologize. I don't mean to make light of it, because really, again, mistakes like this do have implications on the forward progress of the city. And unfortunately, it's not just that they're going to miss 6 months of this kind of community engagement work. It's that it sent a pretty clear message to the community that they don't care about community engagement. And the person who put it forward was like, well, democracy is if you've got something to say, you come find me or call me, with no awareness of the fact that that model doesn't work if you've not communicated to the public first that there's a good reason to bother communicating in that way. And that they seem to have a blind spot about how much of Geneva they're missing. I think they've got a pretty good echo chamber of people that reinforce what they're already thinking. And I don't think they are aware of the, like you said, the very active, both online and in person, if you happen to be out in the neighborhoods, sense of disconnect and real unwillingness to engage with the guys on the terms that they've laid out themselves.
I've seen this happen in so many different government structures now over my career in cities and towns and villages where there's this, if, like you said, if you have a problem, you need to come talk to us. If you don't have a problem, there is no problem.
Right.
Or if you don't bring a problem to us, there is no problem. But that is quite literally the model that's bred the mistrust we see in government.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yep.
Like, that is it. Because all city business seems to happen in a 2.5-hour window. And then the rest of the month, it's hard to find the electeds because the electeds are part-time people who usually have other jobs and responsibilities and families and lives. They're human. And having a communications person, a community engagement person, whatever it is, whatever you call that position, it can solve some of those problems. It can't solve all of them, but to me, that's the dilemma that you're left in. But if City Council feels it's better fit moving forward without the position, I guess time will tell, and that'll be it. Let's shift gears a little bit. Since our last episode, Wells College went from accepting new students to being completely shut down. All of this happened between April 30th and present day, basically. The announcement came on April 30th with lots of reporting after, showing very few people on campus saw this coming. There was a really interesting story on The Citizen who basically uncovered that a draft closure announcement wound up on the Wells College website in January. It was online for a while, and it came offline, and then it was online again. And then when the Citizen ran their story and reached out to the college for comment because it had the date mark on it, they said it was a mistake, and then a couple days later it was gone. Obviously, there's this whole assumption, right, that like someone had to have known. Like, you don't go from, hey, we're accepting students in January or February to, hey guys, we're shutting it down. Can't go any further. Like, there had to have been some knowledge somewhere. So of the stories that you've seen, of the coverage that you've been able to catch of this, I'm curious. Obviously, Casanova College closed within the last year now too. Do you think people really buy the idea that nobody knew?
No. Well, I mean, what?
Do you think it would even be possible?
Well, I was going to say, what does that mean? I mean, if you didn't know, that's a whole range of like administrative concern, right?
The fiscal cliff got really close.
So I mean, I think there's no good option there other than to just say, yes, like here's what led to this, and then maybe other colleges can learn from that and avoid some of the moves that Wells did or didn't make to get to where they ended up. But no, I don't see how it's possible that no one knew. It does make me wonder about the accreditation agencies, because like the accreditation process, which I am not familiar with, so I'm not going to talk out of turn and speak to that. But I do wonder how a college that has recently completed an accreditation process did not have any fiscal red flags, waved to say other, prospective students, parents, faculty, staff, maybe you ought to ask some more questions in this direction. Because I was always under the assumption that colleges and universities were very well regulated, and that included oversight of their fiscal position. So this, this has caused concern to me on a professional level, but it is interesting.
So Wells was sort of ridiculed by a couple entities that govern higher ed after the announcement came out, but it's almost like I took that as, well, that's too late now, right? Like that doesn't, like if that's when you're responding,
Right.
that's not helping anybody. Faculty and students were completely blindsided by the announcement when in April 30th. And you think about like the students, I think about the students in that situation because I'm not sure what their academic calendar exactly looks like, but you're down to like what, the last few weeks of school at that point, right? And all of a sudden you have to make plans of where you're going. And then I haven't seen any updates on it, but as of a few weeks ago, a bunch of teach out programs also hadn't been approved. There were some that had been approved, some that hadn't been approved. It feels like a situation where there should be lots of regulation, especially with how much money students and families are investing. And yet it seems like there isn't. It's pretty hands off. And the colleges, private institutions, I guess they're private institutions. So, how can you govern them? They're allowed to act as they see fit. And I guess when the money runs out, they pull the plug and that's it. No.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's generally, I mean, I certainly don't.
I'd like to hope
would
that's
not
common.
to leave the conversation with the impression that somehow colleges and universities are completely unregulated, because I don't think that's true. But I do wonder about the class of colleges that we've seen closed, right? So, and one of the things, I've had the benefit of instructing students who have been on a teach out plan from other institutions like Medaille or Casnovia, who've then come to Cayuga. And, it does cause a lot of stress to the students because there are certain classes that then don't transfer. So maybe they were in year 3, or in the case of Wells, some students in year 4, and they don't have now the corresponding credits under the other, regulated institution that's in compliance and is still going to meet that particular diploma requirement. And there has to be some adjustments, some last minute scrambling. And I do feel like that's a really unfortunate position to put students in, because especially in our current economic situation, and we're talking about the housing crisis. I mean, committing to a college or university for 4 years, by the time someone gets to their 3rd or 4th year, some students are living off campus. They have housing expense, they have leases, and they kind of need to plan the next step. And they didn't expect to have to stay another semester and do more work. I find it unfortunate. I feel for the students, the staff, and the faculty, and it does make me wonder what the administrators knew, and the missing communication piece seems to be a common thread in our discussions today.
Better guardrails, I guess. Not regulation, but like I'm sure there's a plethora of regulation, but better guardrails to avoid this kind of situation. Obviously, I can understand why they would probably be advocating against it, because if all of a sudden, I can go back to the pandemic. I interviewed President Gibraltar back then about the financial crisis they were facing during the pandemic, when colleges were forced to be closed, and they point blank said that if they weren't able to open in the fall, they would close permanently because they wouldn't be able to fund their operation and continue on. That was the first. After that, it was sort of assumed that the financial situation had resolved itself or that things were okay. Obviously, that wasn't the case. But you would think that outside of a global pandemic that absolutely nobody saw coming, students or families or prospective students would have a runway. Like, hey, we're in X situation, and that could mean this in 2 years, that could mean this in 4 years, and that could mean this in 6 years, so that students can plan. But I can understand from the college's point of view, I'm sure enrollment would immediately like drop if that were common. So it's just this predicament, I guess. It just stinks for students and families. Fortunately, it's a relatively small school, so I think everything is okay for most of the students. But it's a shame. It's also a shame, I'll say this, and we've talked about housing. It's a shame to me that an entity that, or a space that was a college is probably just going to be like short-term rentals now and various forms of housing. Probably not the kinds of housing that the community really needs. But that's just kind of like, I guess, one of the kind of disappointing arms of this story. But hey, we'll see. Let's talk about Seneca Falls. The planned sale of 2 and 10 Fall Street in Seneca Falls was canceled earlier this month. The sale of those 2 properties at the bottom of Fall Street near Van Cleef Lake, you're looking at it right there on the screen, fell through. The plan was upscale apartments and retail space. Now the town has found a new developer as they go back to the drawing board, as you can imagine. A lot of feedback on this story was negative, but here's my thing. Back in my column writing days, and even on this program, I took a bunch of heat for saying that the village of Newark was more deserving of winning the DRI than Seneca Falls, back when neither had won it. There appeared to be more long-term planning and progress by electeds. Now let's talk about Seneca Falls and Newark. Present day, Newark continues to have a resounding message of good things are happening here. There is constant messaging from the village about the things that are happening, whether it has to do with DRI, whether it just has to do with community events, whether it just has to do with, and that's largely to do with Mayor John Taylor and Robin Bremer, who's worked for the village for a long time. Seneca Falls isn't doing that. A lot of communities, as we just talked about, aren't doing that. So why does this matter? Bad news wins the day in Seneca Falls. Good news never has the chance to win if you aren't putting it out there. And it is absolutely paramount for municipalities of all sizes to put the good news out there if you want the good news to win the day. If you want the bad news to be the thing that everybody sees, because the reaction to this story about the sale of these 2 properties falling through was a mixed bag of negativity and nihilism, right? Just straight up.
I can imagine.
Right, like you see it in every community, right? On social media especially.
Yep.
But you can't pretend that that's not something that you have to deal with. And communities can beat it. You know, if you Google the village of Newark, you see a dozen plus stories from the last 4 months about various things that the village is doing and programs and progress on DRI and a lot of, say like boring, a lot of boring stuff. Hey, we're putting in new sewer lines on X, Y, and Z streets. It's good news.
Yep.
But in communities like Seneca Falls, and there's a lot of them, so I'm not just pointing at you, Seneca Falls. When you give people fuel to only say or only point to the bad things, that's what they're going to do. They're going to live off of that fuel. Give them good stuff to work with. It's very frustrating because I go back, I mentioned when I was writing that column for the Finger Lakes Times, and a lot of people, I grew up in Seneca Falls, so there was this impression back then that I was like selling out my town. Like I was, saying like, I don't want Seneca Falls to win. No, like Newark, because of their messaging, because of their long-term planning, at the very least created the appearance that they were better suited for it. And that was the crux of my frustration then. And to see this happen now, And hopefully hopefully the town is able to find a developer for that property. Obviously, you could see from that Google Maps view, that Earth view, it's a prime spot. It's
prime location.
probably the town's best spot because you're literally looking over the lake. It's giant. It's wide open. It's on a little bit of a hill, and it backs right down to downtown proper.
Right.
Huge opportunity. Basically, one of the only blank canvases left.
Yeah.
And again, nothing. Hopefully that changes, though.
I mean, I definitely can empathize with your pain of the reaction to writing that column, because I often, I get a lot of response to my column. Some of it's positive, but a lot of people feel like, oh, if by criticizing Geneva, what should they be doing? And I do try to offer solutions, but I think the point you're making, it's not about spin, which I think is the criticism then that people give, right? You want somebody to give up. You're just saying puff up your community, and that's not legitimate, right? But I think what you're pointing to is something that, I'm going to utter those two words again, Geneva's comprehensive plan talked about, which is that if you don't tell the story of why your community is worth investing in and living in, people will fill in the blanks. And they're going to fill in the blanks usually with the worst version of your community. And what's frustrating, you see it in Seneca Falls, you see it in Geneva. They just had a meeting to talk about the budget. And if anybody watched that who was a potential developer, they would walk away. Because it is this doom and gloom scenario. I mean, again, it would be funny if it weren't so sad. You've got a counselor saying, we got to get more tourists into downtown. And I'm going to go to every shop and have them put a no trespassing sign in the window. And I just thought, okay, can we use one bit of our brain for a minute and just figure out, how do you invite tourists into your area? Is it by scaring them or by projecting what's great and pleasant and worth seeking out? And I think we're seeing the same thing in Seneca Falls. I mean, it's a challenge, right? Seneca Falls, there's no getting around the odor. There's no getting around that giant trash heap that dominates a lot of the news. And they've got to figure out a way to have a reasonable plan so that people want to invest there and feel like, financially, environmentally, health-wise, that they're safe. But a message like that exists. Policies like that exist. The question is, do you want to embrace them and embrace economic development, or do you just want to lament and complain and talk about what's bad and chase people away?
Yeah, and part of what I see as the challenge here is just creating the regimented process of communicating what's going on in the community. Short of, well, did you go to the meeting?
Right.
Did you watch the meeting? Or did you read the minutes of the meeting? That is not how you want to communicate with your community.
No, you have to have a vision. You have to have a plan. You have to show people in writing and in communication in a transparent, clear, authentic way. This is what this community can and will be.
Yeah.
Here are the steps to get there.
Create the good news.
Yeah.
Very interesting last observation on this for me. Back then, I remember feeling like there was this assumption that I didn't love or care about the community. And it's just funny because if you love or care about your community, you want there to be more good news about it, right?
Yes.
Right?
Thank you for saying that.
So,
the truth.
that's where we stand with that. All right, last topic of the day. New York State announced a digital portal last week to help make free or low-cost childcare more accessible because, per Governor Kathy Hochul, a majority of New Yorkers qualify for assistance on a sliding scale if their income is at or below 85% of the state's median income, which for a family of 4 is $108,000. And you're looking at that portal right now on the screen. So me, childless Josh, hopped on that website just to see. I wanted to see what it was like, how it works. Because I thought to myself, it's got to be similar to the state's healthcare portal, which is pretty easy to navigate. You can figure out what kind of subsidies exist if you qualify, and it's all really easy. Not this one. So there were 2 huge issues that I saw that really made me question why the governor announced it in the first place. One, no matter what numbers I put in on the calculator, I kept getting this message. You may not be eligible for childcare at low or no cost through the Child Care Assistance Program. You are encouraged to apply for an official determination. So you're telling people, because there is a child care crisis in New York and a lot of other places too, you're telling people who have been dealing with this crisis and raising kids for years now in this environment to go to this website to see if they qualify and then be told that they have to go through a lengthy determination process, which involves basically like sending a form by mail or electronically and then waiting for a determination days or weeks after that. You're telling them that that's the new, fast, easy way to do it. And then when you go through, there's another portal off of that page that says, hey, find childcare here. And you click it, and there's a box directly below the form that says only show places with open slots in X, Y, and Z categories, and you check them out. If you don't, it shows all of them. So a person would more likely do the search, see all the places, and then start calling and be met with, hey, we don't have any openings. We don't have any openings, because when you actually check that box, nothing comes up for a lion's share of communities around here. Geneva, as an example, 0 openings at all. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like, I think of Geneva as probably having a higher demand and higher need for subsidized childcare than other communities around, just because there's a larger population. It's a larger population center. So if the problem exists, probably exists worse there. But that actually was true in a lot of places, or in a lot of towns or villages. There was just one option, which, I don't know, just to me, like this felt a lot like putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, where the state's like, hey, we have this shiny new platform that's going to make it so easy to get childcare and get it subsidized along the way. And that's just not the case at all. Like, the crisis exists in such a severe way that there needs to be more childcare options before we can start celebrating a platform that's going to make it easier to get childcare, right?
I mean, it almost makes it sound like some kind of strange plan to intentionally frustrate people so that they raise this issue. Like, I just wonder, what would be the point of that? That is frustrating. And, even though I was fortunate to not have to need childcare for my kids, I feel like I hear and have heard over and over how difficult it is to find a spot, to pay for a spot. And again, this is one of those issues that is economic development, but it's not seen that way by traditional legislators, right? They think this is a public or human service. Human services are accessory. Human services are expendable. We need to, build stuff. It's like, okay, build all you want. You can't get anybody to work there because nobody can watch their children. Then what are we going to do? So, and it's interesting to me that you give the Geneva example, because I know that there are centers in Geneva that do have spots that are open, which makes me wonder, what was the back end rollout to try to work with childcare providers to make sure their information was up to date? And is it a real-time census of childcare? Like, how frequently is it updating? Is it pulling numbers from, older county services directories that showed that there were no vacancies and now there are? It's
okay. So I'm glad you said that, because that was the first thing that came to my mind when I'm actually using the income and family breakdown form to like estimate. I just kept getting, no matter how I changed the numbers, I just kept getting the same message. You may not qualify, but you're encouraged to apply. And I thought to myself, well, maybe this is just is this an error? Like, did they just hastily roll this thing out to get some good press at the end of a week? Or
Could be.
like, is it not working properly? It's same said for the slots that are or aren't available in the city of Rochester, like, or in Geneva rather, excuse me. That is to me the bigger question, if not the what are we doing?
Right.
It is just a mind-boggling thing. But to your point, it's an economic development issue. It has to be viewed that way. I mean, obviously I live in Webster, but we have friends who are paying upwards of $15,000, $18,000, $20,000 a year for daycare, for run-of-the-mill daycare, not anything. I say that because, especially for older folks, there is this frequent assumption that if you're paying what is now market rate, because those folks have not had children in a long time, there's this assumption that you're paying for some extravagant extra service beyond just typical run-of-the-mill daycare, which is precisely what these people are paying for.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I just wanted to say, I do think people who aren't necessarily in it looking for childcare right now, I don't think they, again, elected officials have taken the time to see what the landscape is like, what it costs, what the quality is, where there could be improvements on all three of those things, but also around this word subsidy, right? As soon as people hear that there's a subsidy for something, it becomes this political football. People don't understand that the subsidized rate, the income rate at which people qualify for housing subsidies, childcare subsidies, is actually meeting the needs of a much larger population than what's in their head. And I think that whatever political hangups they have, which again, I wish they would abandon, but to the extent that they have them, they never check their assumptions. So I think it would be useful at this point for elected officials who are learning about this to really go in and see what does the sliding scale look like and what kind of effect does that have on people's quality of life. Because it's an issue for so many people, and it's not something you generally hear talked about at a county meeting or a city meeting or a village meeting or a town meeting, but then it gets some state press like this, and hopefully people realize we need to be talking about it more because it has raised a whole variety of issues. But I agree, that sounds like just a terrible rollout by the state. Hopefully a well-intentioned program with poor execution that can be fixed, but maybe a total mismatch because maybe it's promising something it just simply cannot deliver.
And to the anti-subsidy crowd, which I'll say I'm neither pro nor against the subsidy. To me, a subsidy is just a response to the market, right?
Right.
Like that's how I view it. But what does it tell you about the cost of childcare that a family of four who makes 85% of $108,000 is eligible for a subsidy?
Right.
What's it tell you about the cost of childcare?
Yeah, I mean, what's
That's
the median
serious.
income in the city of Geneva or the town of Seneca Falls? Like, what, you've got a large percentage of your middle class people, your neighbors.
And by the way,
qualifying.
it is, from what the governor's announcement said, it's based on the state's median household income. So think about a lot of the communities around here, 85% of 108,000 for a family of four. I mean, there might be entire populations of like 80, 90% population of various populations, communities that would qualify.
Yes.
That's something.
Yep.
Hey, that's going to do it for today. If you have a question, email it to debrief@fingerlakes1.com. We'll get to it next time. Thanks for listening and watching. We'll see you later.